Good afternoon. All right, and so we find ourselves now on the Constitution. I hope the previous video was helpful, as I was going to share the same information as you found in that. And I oftentimes add a little bit of information or nuance to a thesis on many assignments every semester. I'm never content in that way, but that actually is an exception. I had nothing to add this semester on that last assignment. So what you should have gone over was the fall of the Articles of Confederation and the very old, popular, somewhat boring thesis, because there isn't a lot of historiographical debate on that topic. That thesis has held very well. That singular generation had a chance at a more decentralized, more democratic government than we have today, and they blew it. They messed up their chance, like an adolescent child who was suddenly given more freedom than he or she had previously had, and then misbehaved, got into trouble, and then had to have the parents take back some of that freedom and that autonomy. So you see it in the examples of the way that they played with credit availability and cancellation of debts, and that led to a couple rebellions. You saw the way they fought with one another over territory and commercial wars, as far as them having a confederation. At any rate, what you see is that the founding fathers, being a well-read, classically educated demographic, they had read plenty of Greco criticism of democracy. When you look at Pericles in Athens, and other examples, the Gracchus brothers of Rome, and you see the way that democracy could take a destructive turn. So the founding fathers, being well read on that, is supposedly played right into the conservatives' hands, where they could tell the libertarian counterparts, "See, I told you. You've already read this. You should have known that was going to happen with too democratic of a confederation." And then with the confederation, you have the Italian city-states, the Scandinavian ones, etc. And you have evidence historically of them kind of divided against one another, and having issues, negative consequences from that type of government, that loosely constructed of a government as well. And that also played into their hands. So then with the second one, I hope you notice that, the founding fathers may have been a little bit, they may have required quite a bit of pressure to acquiesce into giving the enlightened components, some of the enlightened components that we find in the Constitution today. So clearly, right, when you look at the republic that we have, you have House reps, right? You have senators in the upper house. You have the president, and then I separately would include the president's cabinet, fourthly. And then you have the Supreme Court. So you have at least 5 major, faces to the federal government. And how many of those were directly elected by citizens? 1, only the House reps. And that was, right, elected by citizens that the states decided had met their state requirements for citizenship. So nothing near universal enfranchisement, the fancy word, universal citizenship for all humanity. And so this really, when you look at it in many ways, is a relatively conservative document. The founding fathers being convinced that too much democracy, too decentralized of a government did not work, and that it was in their best interest for preservation, for unity, for prosperity, etc., to unite in a centrally stronger and, yes, less democratic government. All right. So at any rate, what I ask you to do is I ask you to go through, I gave like a copied and pasted the original Constitution, a copy of the original Constitution on here. And I ask you to put three more. I gave you one example in each, three more examples into each category. Now, the only thing I ask that you have at least one example used somewhere in all, in it's not all three because there are more than three, but in the first three articles, something from the national legislator or Congress, something from the section on the presidency, okay, and then something from the section on the Supreme Court, okay. But you do not, as you go through this, have to categorize every article that you read, okay? Not by any means. All I'm asking is you to go through, and that which stands out to you as enlightened, give three examples of such. Conservative, same thing, and pragmatic, same thing. All right, so this is a little different from the analysis and evaluation oriented assignments that you do with argumentative pieces. All right. So enlightened, this is my type of, my quirky definition for it. Any element to this Constitution that is ostensibly designed to prevent tyranny. This includes methods of checks and balances of one branch of the government over another. Any measure intended to ensure transparency or accountability of officials to the people or others. Limitations to discretionary powers of rulers, and any powers vested in the most democratically elected body, in this case, the House of Reps. The blatant example of this is the Bill of Rights, ensuring citizens' basic rights and freedom. All right. I want to apologize preemptively if I sneeze. I feel it coming on. So then secondly, the second category is conservative. Any element to this Constitution that seems to conserve early modern or medieval notions, like the following: power vested in a, quote, better sort, or an elite entrusted to use its own discretion without much accountability to the governed. Power centralized in a strong central government agency, like a unitary government, where the central government dictates everything to the local environs, as opposed to deliberately weakened and decentralized, limited democracy, right? Strong executive and military resources that can curtail or cut short individuals' freedoms in the name of order and stability. Okay, an example of this is that only one half of one branch amongst the three originally consisted of properly elected officials, and only by those granted citizenship status by their respective states. Then the third one, okay, is pragmatic. So to me, right, with pragmatic, they're not really dealing with the kind of dichotomy that you see in the first two, right? With the first two, it's like old school, and that you want a better sort ruling. You want a centralized, distant government dictating things to the people throughout. You want law and order. You want a strong military. You want to be able to squash rebellions, etc., all in the name of domestic tranquility and so forth. Or you want enlightenment. You want accountability of rulers. You want checks and balances. You want participation by the common citizens, etc., right? With pragmatic, it's almost doesn't even enter that discourse, that debate. With pragmatic, it's just simply practical. It's not necessarily liberal or conservative. It just simply seems to address a very practical issue that may arise in the Republic. So inherently amoral. It's not into what's right or wrong, liberal or conservative, simply designed for expediency, right? For that which is convenient, as a compromise between disparate, different factions, groups of like-minded individuals with similar views and self-interest, or designed to address exigencies, like emergencies, problems, issues that may arise in the future. An example of this, sadly, may be the tacit acceptance of slavery to placate the planter faction and ensure their ratification of the Constitution, of the document. Now, notice, slavery could also be put in the category of conservative, right? So I find that it's, conservative and enlightened are almost antithetical, opposite. So that it's, to me, subjectively, it's very difficult to get confused one or the other. It seems to heavily, lean toward one or the other, but not both simultaneously. But with the second and third categories, I find oftentimes they can. Okay. So that's why what I ask of you is just in a simple sentence, defend why you put that clause in that particular category. So you see what I put here. Article 1, Section 2. I put that as an example of enlightened, subjectively. House reps are directly elected by citizens every 2 years and must be inhabitants of the congressional districts which they represent. I put this as enlightened because they are frequently held accountable to their constituents via election and are privy to what their constituents face daily and having a residence in their constituents' environment. So I briefly gave a reason for why I think Article 1, Section 2 is enlightened. Okay, so I asked you to give 3 more. Conservative. Article 1, Section 2. Did I make a mistake here? And counting citizens to determine taxes and the number of House reps to serve in Congress from each state, the Constitution mentions that 3/5 of other persons and Native Americans do not count. This is conservative because just as in millennia past, the Founding Fathers did not embrace the courage and progressive tolerance to declare universal citizenship for all people. So they're going to treat Native Americans as a, quote, nation within the nation, a separate people. Later on, they'll call them the ward of the state, which would not bode well for the future for them. And then 3/5 of all other persons, of course, are slaves. So clearly differentiated from citizens that are to be counted when you decide how many House reps each state gets. All right. Then I put for pragmatic, Article 1, Section 8, that federal Congress can deal with practical issues like bankruptcies, inventions, borrowing money, and defending the nation against revolts and invasions. This seems pragmatic and that such issues will almost inevitably need to be dealt with. That was a little bit vague there in my defense. But nevertheless, I gave a basic reason why I felt those examples are pragmatic. They're not necessarily conservative, nor enlightened or liberal. They're just practical. They're practically oriented. All right. And notice my 2 cents here on the preamble. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. So notice right away, right? It is suggesting that sovereignty comes from the people. And remember, they got that from Rousseau and from John Locke and his Second Treatise on Government, the idea of the social contract, that we, the people, are the sovereigns, and we grant authority to a government, right, that has our permission to function. And what are the reasons for that government? To form a more perfect union? Remember, we were a mess in the Confederation. I would argue that that reason, however, is conservative. Establish justice, I think conservative. Ensure domestic tranquility, almost a euphemism for the same one. I think that's conservative. Provide for the common defense. Yes, I think that's conservative. Promote the general welfare. I think that's conservative as well. And then finally, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our future. Do ordain and establish this Constitution. So notice it gives like 4 or 5 reasons for which we, the people, sovereignly give permission for a government to exist. And to me, only the last reason is an enlightened one, is to protect our liberties. All right. So Article 1, because we have a republic like Rome, right? Rome had popularly elected tribunes. Then they had handpicked senators in their Senate. And then the Senate elected 2 consuls or presidents. So Rome was a mixed government, right? It was somewhat democratic, the demos meaning the people in Greek, somewhat aristocratic, aristoi meaning the best in Greek, like the cream of the crop, getting the positions, and then somewhat monarchical, where they have, in their case, not 1, but 2 consuls as the sovereign executives. So going back to the United States, right? The House of Reps, ideally, because they have to be reelected every 2 years, they're highly held accountable, theoretically, to the citizens. But again, each state gets to decide on the qualifications for citizenship. So that's not very liberal or enlightened. But they do, right? And then the senators, they are one step removed from democratic representation. Is the democratically elected state legislators in each state get to, amongst themselves as elected men, get to elect amongst their own body their 2 senators. And of course, that's not the case anymore, right? We've had the, what is it, the 17th Amendment, the direct election of senators, but that won't be for a long time. So they're clearly a bit, they're deliberately a step removed from the common vote, okay? And then, of course, you have the president, and you have the electoral college system, which we still have to this day, right? And at first, you directly elected the electors. They were actual people who went and casted their own vote for the president. And of course, by the time of Andrew Jackson that we get into, that will change, and there will be the direct popular election of electoral points. Okay, so clearly that is not direct representation. It's not direct representative democracy when it comes to the president and vice president. Then they handpick their cabinet members with the approval of the indirectly elected senators who had been elected by elected men in the state legislators, right? And then you also have handpicked Supreme Court justices who get to serve for life and need not worry about what the majority of population, where their sentiment lies, because they're not beholden to the popular sentiment. So at any rate, when you look at it, right, you could see that there was a bit of an aristocratic bent to this original Constitution. And to a lot of the founding fathers, right, they felt like the conservatives, at least, right, who were largely behind writing this Constitution and did so much to try to make sure that it was ratified. Hamilton, John Adams, and others, right? And at that time, Madison. So they contend that while everyone ought to be, and of course they don't include Native Americans, they don't include women, and they don't include African Americans, but with those grand exceptions, they contended that while human beings ought to be entitled to the same basic protections of the law, okay, remember, to me, that's like the Roman second level of citizenship, the basic protections under the law. Not everyone is equally capable of writing an English paper for you, playing soccer, of whatever it might be, right? We're all different in the allotment, the natural innate allotment of gifts from the womb. And also not only by nature, but also by nurture. Some of us have been groomed, trained, educated in the most advantageous way, while other kids had to work manual labor and nothing but such from the time they could virtually walk. And so because of the innate and by nurture and environmental differences amongst humans that just naturally occur, they believed some people are more qualified than their contemporaries, than others, in ruling. And it makes me think of like Plato's Republic, right? Where he contended that, you know, the naturally bright kids are separated from the other kids in a school system, and their innate intelligence and their innate virtue are only magnified by the proper philosophical education and training in altruistic service and helping out other human beings and serving their contemporaries and so forth, that they're groomed and prepared by nature and nurture to wear those special color ribbons and be the philosopher kings over the rest of their contemporaries. You see that type of elitism amongst the conservatives, the Federalists, amongst the founding fathers. Okay. So they said, hey, yeah, we're not trying to say that we're innately more entitled to certain citizenship rights or protections or anything like that, but we just are the better sort. We're better qualified to be your politicians. Okay. So at any rate, to them, right, the elected reps, as well as those who were appointed or indirectly elected, right, like the senators and the president, that they should serve and think of themselves as stewards. To me, a steward, an example of stewardship would be a babysitter, someone entrusted with something that you hold very dear. Okay. And so they believed that as stewards, they ought to use their superior education, their superior intellect, their virtue, as well as another key factor that they would note oftentimes was their leisure. The wealthy literally were known for quite some time as the leisure class because they didn't have to work from sun up to sundown. They had time to pontificate on things and read books, et cetera, et cetera. So at any rate, they contended that they ought to be the stewards of power. Okay. And, to more liberal, libertarian Americans that would form, as you'll see very soon in the next subject, a liberal oppositional party in the form of the Democratic Republicans. They contended, no. You can learn, or you could know quite often the wiser course of action as a politician by virtue of an innate intelligence and by virtue of a superior quality education and leisure time and reading and all that. But you can morally choose not to follow those dictates of what you've learned and instead try to enrich yourself at the expense of other people. So what was questioned highly by the libertarian liberals was the old Greek equation and connection between education and virtue, right? As they contended, I don't care how intelligent you are. I don't care how well educated you are. That doesn't mean you're going to morally choose to do the right thing. You might just be awful morally and completely know better and do everything that you're doing wrongly with your eyes wide open. So at any rate, to that group, right, you had those who contended that you ought to be a mere mouthpiece of what your constituents want, that you're basically like a megaphone, right? You find out, you live amongst your constituents, you find out what they want, what they're going through, what their sentiments are, their fears, desires, obstacles, etc., values, and you simply exemplify and share that information and try to put it into policy as their reps, as their politicians. Okay. And then amongst that group, you had a group of people like Thomas Jefferson, who contended that the educated people or the uneducated masses, they may not have the technical expertise to know the nuances of political philosophy, right? A political science, but they have sagacity. Sagacity is common sense, street smarts, an innate worldly wisdom. They know a crooked politician from a virtuous one. They know a practically beneficent idea versus a detrimental one. And so hence they could at least be entrusted with voting for as many offices as possible and knowing a good and qualified and virtuous candidate versus another. So at any rate, you had these types of differences, right? And then, of course, to those who were the conservatives who advocated a strong central government, they didn't do it. They weren't as overt about it as you might think. They were at times a little bit in the Federalist Papers. Remember, the Federalist Papers were a group of what 85, 87 short essays defending the need for a less democratic, more centralized government than they had under the Confederation. And of course, in doing so, they almost always pitched it in a pragmatic vein. They made it look as if a stronger central government is just right or wrong, good or bad. It's just necessary. It's practically necessary. All right, because of course, even the conservatives, they contended that they weren't for a tyrannical government. They didn't advocate, we want a highly centralized unitary government where Washington, D.C. Dictates everything to Modesto, California, and they have no need for legal representation, for legislation. We don't plan to feel any sense of accountability to these remote cities and remote states. Of course not. They didn't advocate that privately or publicly. Of course, they contended, right, that they were fighting against alleged tyranny with Great Britain. But they contended that this decentralized government is a mess. So take a look in Article 1, Section 8. This is pretty big and deviating from the Confederation. Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, and all duties, imposts, and excises shall be uniform throughout states. So before, if your elected rep in your region said no to a tax, it wasn't collected there. Not anymore. If 50% plus one of House reps, 50% plus one of senators approve of a tax, it doesn't matter what your elected rep or all of his or her constituents wanted or didn't want, that tax is being collective now everywhere. So that is called coercive tax power. Okay, so that was, seen as pragmatically necessary by the conservatives and seen as quasi tyrannical by the libertarian liberals. To borrow money on behalf of the U.S., to regulate trade with foreign countries and among the states and with the tribes, to establish a uniform rule of naturalization, bankruptcies, etc., to coin money, start weights and measures. So of course, we didn't go on the metric system. So let's see here, going on. Look at number 11. Congress can declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal, make rules concerning captures on land and water. Congress can raise and support armies. Okay. Let's see here. Look at number 15, to provide for calling forth the state militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. And that was seen as a big Scottish libertarian sentiment that local people ought to be able to democratically, locally have their own autonomy, elect their own militia leaders, and fight, almost separately from not foreign, but from far away, distant, centralized military establishments. But now they can grab all of the militias and incorporate them forcefully into the U.S. Armed Forces. Okay. So, and then look at number 18. To make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the aforementioned powers. So they're giving themselves some wiggle room here, right? So yes, we have 17 examples of what Congress can do virtually over the power of the states, right? So this is a much more centralized government than our Confederation. But they say also, they shall, as the National Congress, do whatever in the future is necessary and proper in carrying out any of the previous 17 specifically stated powers. So that gives them extra wiggle room. and that scared libertarians. Okay. The migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by Congress prior to the year 1808. So they're saying Congress can't even contemplate ending the slave trade until 1808. And this was 1787. So they're giving themselves 20 years. All right. Let's see here. This was arguably enlightened. Number 8, no title of nobility shall be granted by the U.S. All right. So anyone elected into office in the form of any of the 3 branches, you cannot, you can't accept a title of nobility. So we're claiming, right, relative equality of opportunity in the economic realm. We're declaring a regulated, government-involved, somewhat capitalist economy, somewhat open to all, and there will be no landed nobility. So no British patronage system of having to have the correct papers and the correct connections to do something for a living. So that arguably is very enlightened. Let's see here. And you guys are probably familiar with this right here. No person except a natural born citizen or a citizen of the United States at the time of the adoption of the Constitution shall be eligible for the office of president. Neither shall any person be eligible to that office who shall have not attained the age of 35 and have been 14 years a resident within the U.S. That's arguably conservative. This is arguably enlightened. Before he enter on the execution of his office, he shall take the oath of affirmation. I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will do the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. So now it's a rule of law rather than a rule by people. And the rule of law, especially if it's an enlightened document, it plays no favorites, it doesn't change and waver. It's a lot safer against tyranny, supposedly, than trust in the leaders, in the people themselves. And then you're familiar with the checks and balances, right? The House of Reps can impeach the president, right? And the Senate tries the president to decide on removal. That's happened a few times in the nation's history. Let's see here. Now you're talking about the Supreme Court. Let's see here. Look at Article 4, Section 2. The citizens of each state shall be entitled to all privileges and immunities of citizens in the several states. Now we're going to secure that with the 14th Amendment. For some reason, this Section 2, Part 1 here, it didn't have staying power, but that still, reading that section, that's arguably enlightened. No person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall in consequences of any law or regulation therein be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on the claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. That's a Fugitive Slave Act or clause. That's clearly conservative. Section 3, Part 2 will become significant in the Civil War. Congress shall have power to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting territory or other property that are not annexed as states, not yet, but just simply federal territory, that Congress has jurisdiction over them. Talks about how new amendments can be made, how new states can be added to the Union. That might arguably be considered pragmatic or practical. Dealing with rebellion, invasion, treason, that might be considered conservative. It might be considered pragmatic. The United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government. That might be considered enlightened. Article 4, Section 4. Then Article 5, it immediately shows you how an amendment in the future can be added to the Constitution, perhaps pragmatic. All debts contracted and engagements entered to, all contracts, etc., shall be as valid against the United States under this Constitution as under the Confederation. To a lot of people, that's clearly conservative. If someone owes someone else money, if someone owns a slave, any kind of legal contract where people are wanting to hold on to the debt that is owed them, to the service, the labor service that is owed them, etc., right, to the property that they've purchased, they're entitled to that property, to those contractual rights with this new government, just as they had under the Articles of Confederation. Perhaps enlightened is Article 6, Part 2. This Constitution, right, shall be the supreme law of the land. And the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. So again, the rule of law versus the rule of man. An oath or affirmation to support the Constitution, again, Part 3. Let's see here. And then you have the Bill of Rights. And notice what might be either considered enlightened, perhaps pragmatic, is a lot more power in this new document has been given to the central government, right? The federal government in DC, although initially it wasn't in DC. But, right, notice what is in Article 10. The powers not delegated to the U.S. by this Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states, respectively, or to the people. So nothing really is said about police powers, about public education systems, etc. So according to Article 10, those arguably are state issues. All right. So the type of government that we have, technically, it makes sense what they call it. We have a constitutional, right? Because the Constitution is the ultimate authority in the land that all elected politicians and appointed politicians are to give an oath to follow, right? We have a constitutional, federal, and the federal part is that it is a combination of a government that is centrally located, like a unitary government, where the central government dictates everything. We have elements of that, of a very strong central authority, and a confederacy, where the states are given their sovereignty, their independence, and virtually can do what they want, with the exception of a few big things. So the federal part is meant to be a balance of those two styles of government, whereby you still have some local and state autonomy, but they have to share power with a central government that is quite a bit stronger than usually exists under a confederation. So we have a constitutional, federal, republic. like I mentioned, like Rome's Republic. Aristotle made it simple in his designation. It's a little bit democratic, it's a little bit aristocratic, and it's a little bit monarchical. All right, so are there any questions as far as what I'm asking you guys to do? Just give 3 examples into each category and give a sentence or 2 defending your decision. Why you consider it conservative, pragmatic, enlightened. All right. Can I get any affirmation from anyone that you feel relatively prepared for this assignment? And what's a little bit different?
Professor,
Yes.
I have a question. So we do 3 sentences from 3 examples, right, from each one.
Yes, sir. So like I said,
Okay.
you, as long as amongst the 3 combined, not each, amongst the 3 combined, that you have an example found with Congress in Article 1, with the executive in Article 2, and with the judiciary of Article 3. If I could even find one of each of the 3 amongst the 3 categories, I'm content. So like I said, you don't have to, stop at every little article and decide to put that particular article in a section. And you don't have to represent all 3 sections in all 3 categories. I try to keep it relatively simple.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Yeah, I just noticed that all 3 of my examples are from Article 1. I didn't even move on to Article 2 or 3. I should change that. All right. But like I said, especially if you're right, if you're clearly and none, if you clearly just, articulate your reason for why you think it's conservative, enlightened, pragmatic, oftentimes a single sentence will suffice. All right, but at least give me one as to a reason why you put it in that section. Right, and hopefully everyone feels okay on my subjective kind of definitions for these things. Anybody have any questions again on that as to what I mean by enlightened, conservative, pragmatic? All right. Okay, guys. So if it's all right with you, I'm going to go ahead and call it a day. All right. That's everything that I usually convey on this one. I hope that I made myself clear. So there aren't any questions. I understand this is a different type of format than we've been doing and using. We'll go right back to the old format after this. This is one of like 2, I think, 2 or 3 exceptions. All right, you guys, I'm going to go ahead and bid you adieu then, okay? So thank you. Thank you. Okay, you guys take care. Good luck, okay? I appreciate that. Appreciate that very much. You guys, good luck. Hang in there.